All right, we've got Jack Kelley with us tonight, director of the Atlantis puzzle, Unlock the Secrets of Plato's Final Legacy. That was a great documentary, Jack, and we're looking forward to chatting about it. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show, guys.
Yeah, this will be great. Actually, I'm just finishing reading Ignatius Donnelly's book, so it's perfect. It's perfect timing, Not that we'll talk about some of the differences and all that between your movie and what he has in his book, but yeah, it was way more comprehensive than I thought. He had done a lot more work than I thought on all the connections and stuff. So what got you interested in Atlantis? I mean, we might as well start there at the beginning, kind of, because it's it seems like a topic that's more acceptable these days, but only a few years ago, not so much.
No, I mean people would look at you like you just landed from Mars. I
Yeah.
mean, I think I've always loved ancient history and mysteries, and I studied the ancient world in college, and went to Yale, studied in their directed studies program, and I've always just been fascinated by ancient history and architecture and the wars and the battles, and then also just kind of the mysteries of some of these places. I mean, what's more enigmatic than the pyramids, or some of these wonderful ancient temples, like the kind of stuff you find on Malta. I mean, it's just fascinating to think about. And what I generally have to say is, the deeper you go into these subjects, unlike some things, often the more rewarding they are, right? The more interesting tidbits you pick up and the more things you learn. So I guess you would say I was predisposed to have an interest in this, but frankly, I read Plato's books, Timaeus and Critias, many years ago, and I just thought, here's another dry political allegory. Okay, the Atlanteans were bad and they got punished, and then there's a whole lot of philosophy crammed in between, right? And so then, I've told a number of people this, but I was on vacation in, I think it was 2019, on the Greek island of Santorini, and I just happened to stumble on a book that was in a hotel that had George Sarantitis' work. And for those who don't know, George Sarantitis is sort of the guy who rediscovered Atlantis in the 21st century. Yeah, just totally stumbled on this book, totally by accident, reading it by the pool, and there were a lot of other papers in there and stuff, and I was like, just flipping through, and yeah, just started reading George, and I thought, my God, this guy might have finally done it. This guy might have actually figured this out. So at that point, it's like somebody dropped a treasure map or a sack of gold in your hands, and you say, I got to do something with this, right?
And that's when you thought about turning it into a. Did you think about that right then? Like, I got to carry this forward, or?
Yeah, well, I think I was on vacation with my wife, and I just kept talking about this guy and how great he was. And finally, my wife, to shut me up, was like, why don't you just email this guy, and maybe you can talk to him. I wound up connecting with him a few months later, and he sent me a copy of his book, and I was just, the deeper I got into it, the more hooked I became, and I immediately knew that this could make a great film, a very different kind of film than I think maybe some people were expecting. Because I've tried to sort of thread the needle between, I think, what you more find in like a drier history thing, and then on the other side, a more fringe thing. So I've tried to kind of really scrape away, frankly, the nonsense on both sides, and that includes the conservative traditional academic side. There's some nonsense there too, to really get into what is the heart of the matter of this story. What's it really about? And like, what's the meaning for people today, right? Why should people today care about this? There's so many strange and interesting things going on. I mean, you guys are talking about all kinds of stuff on your show with people every week. So why should people pay attention to this? You know?
Yeah. Yeah. It was very well done. I mean, it was
Thanks.
awesome. Very well done. And I guess before we move more towards Atlantis, like when you're talking about going deeper into some of these mysteries, like did you find that you found any answers that sort of, or not answers necessarily, but some ideas of some of these ancient mysteries? Like, you said it was rewarding, but did you come to sort of some conclusions for yourself? Because I noticed for me, it's in some ways, it's more, I come up with more questions.
Right, and that's honestly, Graham, that's one of the reasons why it's called the Atlantis puzzle and not, the Atlantis answer or the Atlantis solution or, we figured it all out. Um, in the course of making this film, you just start kicking over stones, and it's a little bit like the ancient Hydra, right? You chop off one head and two more grow back. You answer one question, and you say, "Oh, I think we figured this out. This is when he wrote this," and you say, "Wait a minute, why did he write that? And then what about this other thing? And then, in that thing, he mentions this other thing." So you sort of start going down not, I don't wouldn't even say it's a rabbit hole. It's almost more like a giant ant colony where there's a million different paths
Right.
you could go down. So, I think it's similar to, I guess I'm attracted to puzzles and problems and complexity, right? And this is certainly, as far as I'm aware, one of the most complex ancient mysteries there is.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. For sure. I would agree with that. And did you ever think that it's kind of weird that you this all happened on Santorini? I mean, I remember being on Santorini in 1990, and they were saying back then that this is Atlantis. Like, there was theories about Santorini being Atlantis. Like that might have been, I mean, I wasn't into that many of them, back then, but it seemed like that was one of the main ones.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that George Sarantitis' work that we cover in the Atlantis puzzle in this documentary is so refreshing is that it's really comparatively easy to come up with something that sounds plausible about an ancient myth, right? There's a lot of ancient myths out there, and we can come up with a lot of ways to explain them, right? Like we could look at the myth of Hercules, aka Heracles, and we could say it was one dude who just was really jacked and he just beat the shit out of a lot of people, and that's what the story's about. But we could also say, it seems pretty hard for this one guy to have done all this stuff. Maybe there's a little bit of and there's no hydras around today. What's the symbolism here? So maybe there's something a little bit deeper. And then we look around and we find things like the pillars of Hercules, which are integral to this story, and we realize that they've occurred in multiple places over multiple times. You start scratching your head a little bit about what is the what's the complexity here? What's the meaning? What does this mean for Greek culture? And could this possibly have been one person? Was it a series of heroes who took on a moniker? As this like Batman in the comics? A new guy puts on the the costume. So that kind of questioning, I think, will take you, deeper into these questions. And it's frankly, it's the same thing with, something like some of the pyramids in Egypt, right? I mean, over the course of 5,000 years or 6,000 years or 7,000, however old they eventually all prove to be, do we really think they were only used once by one group of people? I mean, they must have been reused and continued to, have different meanings of the culture over time, and different people use them. We know certainly the Arabs came in and saw them as sources of treasure or other things, whereas in the ancient world they might have had a more religious or some other connection, like a cathedral.
Yeah, more of a ritualistic function or something.
Maybe, yeah, or maybe multiple functions, right? So
Yeah.
that's the thing. I think that's one of the dangers when, and that's why I think I've tried to stay out of the argument. I'm not I'm not the judge and jury about Atlantis. A lot of people write me messages and stuff on the internet, and they're like, "Well, no, my theory is right." And I sort of say, "Guys, I'm a filmmaker. I did a lot of research. I support George Sarantitis and his work. I don't know all the answers. So I think the most important thing is for everybody to keep questioning, including everything that I'm saying. So, that's the important part, trying to figure these things out for yourself and come to your own understanding of them.
How many like prevailing theories are there? Like how you're talking about getting these emails, how many, what are sort of what are the top five?
Yeah, I mean, just off the top of my head, there's one that people are like, well, he said the story happened 9,000 years before the time of Solon. For those who don't know, the story originates with a real person, Solon, and the story takes place in these two Platonic dialogues and so on, goes to Egypt, and he hears the story of Atlantis from an Egyptian priest at the Temple of Sais. So some people, and he says, well, it happened 9,000 years before the present, which was probably around 593 BC, something like that. And a lot of people have said, well, Plato didn't really mean 9,000 years, he meant 9,000 lunar cycles, and therefore, this all really happened in, like, I don't know what that would be, 1500 BC or 2000 BC. But I think that's a danger that you fall into with these things, right? It's sort of like, okay, this doesn't fit because we're talking about what sounds like a Bronze Age civilization. So let me find a mathematical way to place what this guy said into let me change his words and make it fit a mental model that I understand, right? So I think I'm not in favor of that approach. That's one thing. There are other people who tie in a lot of different mythologies into Atlantis, and they sort of say, well, this is sort of the originator of all these world mythologies, and they all come back to one global civilization, and it all started here. And I'm sort of thinking to myself, yeah, but guys, there were people living all over the world at that time. Were they part of this too? Don't you think they spoke different languages? And from the archaeology, it doesn't look like these same people were all over the place. So that's a tricky one. And then I think maybe the other big one, of course, is the idea of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge and the Azores Islands, and that was actually the theory, Graham, you brought up, that Ignatius Donnelly propagated in his 1882 book, which I think was called, what was it called? Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, wasn't it?
Yep.
Yeah.
Soon to be on audio.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're doing the audio version of it, so it'll be out there.
Oh, that's
soon,
wonderful.
So, yeah,
that's wonderful. As you said, a lot of people give Donnelly a lot of crap today, but he was a really intelligent guy. He was a notable statesman in the U.S. like for a couple decades, and he was, big anti-slavery guy. He was a big proponent of women voting, like an early adopter. He was actually kind of a really honorable character, and he lost a very closely contested election, and that's actually what took him out of politics and gave him the time to write his book. So he's a really interesting figure. But just going to that kind of Donnelly theory, we got to remember when he was writing this, right? This was 1882. So what was going on in 1882? Well, if you guys have read anything about Egypt, or anybody out there listening has, you probably heard of Flinders Petrie, right? He's like the father of modern archaeology. And when was he getting going in his career? 1870s, right? 1880s. So a lot of what we know about archaeology today didn't exist. It was like literally fresh. It was like, I don't know, AI today, right? Like, in 150 years, people will know all kinds of stuff about AI, and there'll be computers in your fingertip or whatever, and they'll be controlling the weather. But they'll look back at us and think about what a bunch of morons we were, right? But the fact is that we're just starting out with that tech. In the same way, I think in the 1800s, people were just starting to get a grasp on archaeology. And the other thing I tell people is, listen, what else was going on at that time? Well, remember, Heinrich Schliemann had just discovered Troy. So this thing that people thought was a myth now became reality. We mentioned that in the Atlantis puzzle, in the documentary. What did that do to people at the time? They just must have been going nuts, right? They also then, Schliemann went and dug at Mycenae, and he dug up some, these graves that looked just like it might be Agamemnon. So all of a sudden, the Trojan War, which was thought for hundreds of years that maybe it was just a myth, is now real. And Flinders Petrie is in Egypt, uncovering all kinds of crazy stuff, suggesting that the timeline of human history goes back far, far, far deeper into the past than people at that time understood. Now, of course, today we look at that and we say, oh, well, of course, there were civilizations in 3, 4, 5,000 BC in Egypt. But at that time, this was like a shocking revelation, right? So I think one of the other things to try to do is like take your mind out of the present try to put yourself back in the mindset of someone like Donnelly. So for the information Donnelly had at the time, let's not forget he didn't have the theory of plate tectonics, which was not accepted universally in universities and academia until like the middle of the 20th century, if you can believe that. So like all three of us grew up learning that in school, right? But if you went back 100 years to Donnelly's time, no one had even heard of the idea of plate tectonics, right? No one understood the movement of the Earth.
Also, I think the freshness of the sounding technology, like to discover the mid-Atlantic ridge from the Challenger, I think that was fairly new too, probably. So
yeah, wasn't it they were laying the transatlantic cables in that time or something? I don't recall, but
yeah, they did that survey of it and they found the ridge all the way across there. So that was, I mean, there was a lot of stuff going on in the 1880s, 1800s. Like, you know, there was all the, you know, theosophical work too that brought a lot of this together. Like from reading all these books, I'm always surprised at how they talk about the Cyclopean architecture and how they talk about the giants and these ancient civilizations and these mysteries. Like I always thought they were kind of more modern mysteries. I didn't realize they were talking about them 150 years ago. But I guess that was probably maybe the start. I mean, or at least, from an archaeological point of view, I guess.
sure. And if you think about it, the very fact that ancient authors referred to that architecture as Cyclopean suggests they were mythologizing it because they didn't know where the hell it came from.
Right.
In many cases, right? Now, that's not to say that some loose stone, large stone walls were not built in Greek and Roman times, because they were, but by and large, that stuff goes back thousands of years preceding, to call it 1 to 3, maybe 4,000 BC, as far as we know, in the Mediterranean. And of course, there's stuff earlier than that, right? There's this stuff on Malta that we mentioned, right? There's those kind of temple structures. They call them temples, but who knows what they were really used for, right? They have stellar alignments and so forth, right? So and then obviously there's Egypt, right? Which whatever people believe, I mean, the very fact that there's evidence of multiple stages of rebuilding Egyptian temples across thousands of years, and the reuse of buildings that we don't even know what happened to them, right? It's like, somebody today goes and sees an old 300-year-old house and they demo it, but they decide to keep the woodwork and the stained glass, right? This is the same thing the ancient Egyptians did. So there's very little way to tell, in some cases, just how old some of these sacred sites or temple sites might have been, because we don't know what was built there before, kind of whatever structure is still existing there today.
And in Egypt, there seems to be a clear degradation in the ability to build those things. And clear evidence right there on the plateau that they're doing something crazy to that stone that we can't really do right now. Maybe
Yeah, I mean,
with machinery that I'm not familiar with, but to do it on the scale that they were doing it, where they're flattening out that granite is something else.
it certainly is, and this is actually I'm actually developing a documentary on the pyramids right now, so it's right up my alley. I have a degree, actually my degree's in architecture, and I'm just fascinated by how these guys build this stuff. And if all this stone came from Aswan, hundreds and hundreds of miles away, and they say, oh, they floated it down the river. Yeah, on what boats? What boat takes a 70-ton granite block? Just one block. Think
Well, are you
about that.
familiar with like Uncharted X and the Brothers of the Serpent? I was going to mention earlier because I think the brothers are, like, as we speak right now, at the Petrie Museum in the UK running scans on those, I think, the vases, right? Is it the vases?
Well, they did a couple vases, the bigger vases. There was a couple of big vases.
But I was going to say, if you're, that the Kemet school tour in Egypt was, we did it 2 years ago, and to get in and see all that stuff, it was just it completely changed my outlook on Egypt 100%. It's like after going there, I came with a clear a clear, you know, in my head at least, I had some clear takeaways that were completely different from sort of everything leading up to that trip, you know, the this or the that or the weapon or the that. I mean, maybe I still wouldn't rule out weapon. I probably would, but I couldn't 100% because my major takeaway is that they were machines. They weren't tombs. They weren't for doing ceremonies or anything like that. In my opinion, those things were machines. I don't know what they were doing, but they were some sort of machines, possibly pressure chambers of some sort. Or, I mean, like I say, I don't know what they were up to. But once you go in and you go through them all, and you know, that's the sort of the feel I got from it. So I would suggest if you're gonna do that, if you haven't already, to jump on one of those tours those guys do. They have another one, I think, this year and a couple next year lined up. It was phenomenal.
Yeah, sounds fantastic. I'm certainly familiar with the father who had passed away, Hakeem. I forget what his last name is. Iwian or something like that.
Aoyan, yeah.
Awian, yeah, yeah. So I mean, you know, that's a different. It's an interesting take, and I mean, I think one of the factors that makes it possible for us to speculate on this stuff is that is the lack of written records, right? It's the lack of concrete history. It's the lack of knowing exactly or having the specific evidence, right? Because if you know there was a plaque, you know, bolted into the ceiling of the king's chamber, and it explained, oh, this is how we built it, and you know, we had this, and actually people thought we didn't have the wheel, but we did, and you know, all this other kind of stuff. Well, then we would have the answer. But what's so puzzling is that there's, you know, in those cases, is you have such little evidence. And I think this is one of the interesting things I'd like to ask you guys about is you have a big audience, you deal with a lot of different interesting characters. What do you think it is that drives people to be fascinated by these ancient mysteries, right? And or even for yourselves, what is it that you know really takes hold of you and grips you, or that you've seen other people really get fascinated about this kind of stuff?
My answer is going to be pretty strange.
You go first then.
Well, so mine would be like, I think we have a genetic memory or past life memories of these things. Like when people get obsessed with, like my girlfriend's obsessed with the Eiffel Tower. And I think she did like a past life regression, and she ended up in, she was a person in France probably during that period. So I do like, I think that reincarnation is kind of a thing, and past lives play a part in that. Like I think that even fantasy, like even Atlantis, it could even apply to Atlantis and the fantasy world, like the giants and the hobbits and the, like even Tolkien's world, like some of that is in some ways was kind of happening back then. You know, we could even say maybe magic was more real. Giant monsters like the megalithic, the megafauna from pre Younger Dryas. You know, dragons seem to be more legit than we thought. I mean, I think all this stuff goes back to like this memory that we've had as humans in those old time frames. That's why I think people are fascinated. Besides the human psychology aspect of needing to know more, like because once you start diving into all this stuff, like you could just keep going down these, like you said, these rabbit holes or these ant hills and keep finding more information. You know, I do think there's something inherent in us to learn more as well. Darren, what about you?
I think it's just human nature, you know. We're out of frontiers. Now, arguably, there's still a big, huge frontier up in northern Canada and in the eastern half of Russia and stuff. Parts, you know. I was actually looking just on a tangent at like this huge national park in the middle of the Northwest Territories. It's like 18-hour drive north of me. There's not even any roads to the thing. The only way to get into it is go down this river. And I'm just thinking, you know, nobody's fucking been there, you know, or like a handful of people. If you went down that river and got like a mile off of the river or 2 miles off of the river, you're into like literally probably uncharted territory, you know, maybe some planes have gone over it or this and that, but not really, you know. And then you start going north of that and you're actually into frontier. And we talked to a guy from Russia, Riley, and he, you know, it's, you look at Russia and it's the same sort of thing. Once you get like, there's not a lot of shit east of Moscow. It's like there's just vast nothingness, and who knows, you know, what's up there. Probably not much, but it's just this, you know, I think we yearn for that Lewis and Clark thing, you know, where I think it's just there's always been some of us that were willing to jump on boats and head out to sea to try and find, and it's just like, or over the next hill or cross over the mountains. And I think it's just in men particularly, I think it's just, and maybe not in all of them, but there's like a measurable percentage of them that are where we were made to explore, and all of a sudden was like, you know, we never evolved to run out of space on this bitch. We were, you know, it was never supposed to happen. We weren't really, you know, you know, maybe we were supposed to happen. Not my place to say what we were supposed to do, but from an evolutionary standpoint, you're not thinking planes. You know what I mean? Like that's all. We haven't caught up with the planes to get from here to there. So theoretically, there was plenty of space for all of us to wander for our entire lives and explore new territories, or at least spend a portion of our lives doing that sort of thing. And then you get the prodigal son returns and all that. But that's all gone. So what do we have left? You know, you have, I think, discovery moving forward, which only certain people are wired for, but you have this, you know, like Graham Hancock says, a species with amnesia. You know, everyone kind of knows the shit they're telling us don't quite make sense, and you know, even just doesn't quite sit right. You know, it's like, well, how do we get all these races so fast? And they, you know, like, because clearly those seem to be evolutionary. So it's like, well, what the fuck is going on here? And or maybe not evolutionary, but adapt. I shouldn't say evolutionary because I'm gonna get called a racist. But I could say they're adaptations to different climates, it would seem. So, you know, I don't know. Maybe that's just a long way to say that these mysteries of the past is, it's sort of this last frontier we have. It's like we don't know. Nobody really knows. We're all speculating a little bit, but we're all, you know, it's this last drive for people to keep searching for answers. And I think people are doing that in all sorts of different directions. But I think this is one that's sort of accessible to layman's.
What do you think, Jack?
Fucking mushrooms like crazy.
Yeah, I mean, I think you guys covered a lot of good points there. I guess I think the human beings are curious. We do have a natural tendency to explore, and one of the, you know, just to kind of bring it back to the subject of Atlantis, that can come in kind of a good way or a bad way, right? Because I would say, in from the negative side, a lot of people project or have projected ideas onto this story or incorporated this story into a lot of Hollywood crap. And I'm saying that as a filmmaker, like a lot of Hollywood crap over the last 100 years. And at the same time, I think what's so paradoxical about the last 200 years is we've uncovered and explored and understood so much. But at the same time, it's like we're out of touch with these ancient time periods, and fewer and fewer people really understand them. And why are we taught all the nonsense we're taught in school, and we're not taught how to be critical thinkers and problem solve in a better way? And I can answer that. At least in the United States, our public education system came about sort of in conjunction with you know, the rise of factories and manufacturing and stuff. So the school systems were kind of set up in many ways to train workers for production lines and for factories, and you know, be very orderly, almost make you a little clockworky, right? And that didn't become fully apparent to me until I got to college and I sat down my first class, and the professor's saying, "Okay, explain this to me." I'm like, "Wait a minute, you're supposed to be explaining it to me. What do you mean me explain it to you?" You know, but that in essence is, you know, that's the core, I think, of the responsibility we have if we want to take these things seriously, right? Because we can always idly speculate, but I think one of the most exciting aspects is when you dive in. And speaking of what you were saying, Darren, exploring, one of the things I uncovered in the process of making this film is that people have been sailing boats and ships. I don't want to say ships because then you think of like a 16th century Spanish galleon, but massive dugout canoes or other types of boats around the world for not just thousands or tens of thousands of years, but hundreds of thousands of years. And in fact, there's some evidence that it may go back a million years.
That's
And I know that
crazy.
it sounds insane. I mean, when I first heard about this, I thought this is some bullshit. Somebody made this up. This is a fringe nonsense thing. But guys, I've read scientific papers about this. In fact, I'm developing a documentary about prehistoric seafaring. This is legit, and the evidence in the last 20 years, so much evidence has been found about this that this is almost ceasing to be a controversial thing. So, to my mind, the idea that people are out sailing across huge oceans and seas and things hundreds of thousands of years ago, including not Homo sapiens, but Neanderthals. And even in Southeast Asia, there's some evidence of Homo erectus. And we're taught that Homo erectus were just a bunch of hairy half apes who could barely use fire. So, how are these guys getting in boats and sailing around Southeast Asia, right?
Yeah. Go ahead, Darren.
Well, no, you should go because mine's going to be it's going to change the direction.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's plus when you look at like the sea level and the map now and all these big continental shelves, I mean, it seems like if all this was land at one point, which after the Younger Dryas kind of says, that this only happened, 12,800 years ago or whatever that was, where all this might have been, easily sailable too. That could have been it could have been much easier to travel the globe with 400 feet, sort of less water around these places.
Yeah, certainly in the Mediterranean and Southeast Asia. So
Yeah.
there are at least three quote unquote lost continents or lost lands of which I'm aware they're totally legit. And right there you have Sundaland, which is the body of land that used to comprise what's now Southeast Asia. And you can see it right there very clearly on the map. That's a bigger area than India.
Right.
I mean, and there's 1.5 billion people living in India. I mean, that's a huge. The other one you see there, north part of Australia,
right
is
there, yeah.
part of that. That was so that New Guinea, Australia, Tasmania was all one body of land, and that was called
Right.
Sahul, I think.
Oh, where was Lemuria? Or
So
is that
that's one that actually is bogus. So Lemuria was this
well, what's
theory.
that like? Couldn't that one off the, or is that a cloud off the coast of Madagascar there? What's that?
So yeah, there are islands and things out there, right? So if the
Yeah.
sea levels were lower, yeah, you'd have a little bits of land here and there. You have the Seychelles. But like Lemuria came about, I believe, because they found the same species, and someone will correct me on this in the notes, I'm sure, but between Madagascar and I think some part of India or Southeast Asia, they found these lemurs, and they said, how the hell did these these lemurs get between here? I mean, lemurs aren't sailing in ships, so somebody must have brought them here, or they hypothesized with all these islands in the Indian Ocean. And again, remember, this is a sort of, I think it was Charles, what was that guy's name? Churchward, something or other. This guy had this theory about this, but it turned out to be unsubstantiated, right? At the same time, there's other places like Doggerland in Europe, which used to be, if you kind of go up there, I mean, so look at, from Denmark all the way to Ireland and the north of France. So apart from that little section that separates Sweden and Norway from Denmark, like that was always like a waterway, that little kind of nook there south of Oslo. But the whole Baltic Sea only came about like in the middle, like during the Holocene, like during the last like 10-12,000 years, because that all came from melting glaciers. So like all that land, Ireland, the UK, and all that stuff that goes all the way pretty far north, apart from a little water that sort of separated it from Norway, like that was all a single body of land up until like honestly the last part of it, I believe, in the sea between the UK and Denmark, the last part of that sank, or didn't sink, right? The sea level rose, the land was stable. It's an important distinction for people to understand. Like there was an island out there until like 5,000 years ago or 6,000 years ago. and they're dredging up all kinds of really interesting stuff from the North Sea there today. So there are real lost continents. I mean, there are real places and people live there, and we don't know almost anything about those people.
And then here's, of course, the Azores, which is one of the prevalent theories of Atlantis.
Mm-hmm. And it's right on that transatlantic ridge, and there's that other ridge on the Pacific side. So before we get into that, I wanted to ask if you're familiar with Samuel Carey's work about the expanding Earth, if you've looked into that stuff at all.
I'm not familiar with it.
So what they found is that at those ocean ridges, the one in the Pacific and the one of the Atlantic, that is some of the, like, I don't know how they measure it, but it's like the newest crust. It's the newest crust on the planet. So they came up with this theory that, and we had Neil Adams on years ago, who's the comic book artist who had done a bunch of illustrations about it, and he kind of talked to us about it on the show. But anyway, that's I don't really have a point to that. I was just asking if you had heard about it, because that whole expansion thing seems to make a lot of sense. It really does.
Well, certainly the Atlantic is expanding today, and that's where all that new stuff's coming up out of the ridge. I mean, I've been in Iceland when you could see visibly, magma fields and stuff like that. So, which is kind of a frightening thing. You start saying, what the heck am I doing out here looking at this stuff? Shouldn't I be shouldn't I be back home safe in North America? But, it's still going on today. That's the other, I think you raise a good point, Darren, which is that these processes of long-term cycles of physical change in our planet and climate change are ongoing, right? I think we had this weird idea in the 20th century that everything was like static, right? Which turned out to be just utterly ridiculous and false. Like, of course it's not static. The planet's, 3.5, 4 billion years old. I don't know. Life and you look at those, there's some great maps out there that show like how all the continents changed over the courses of billions of years, and they've shifted around, and they're continuing to shift, today. So, one of the other fascinating elements about doing the research for the Atlantis puzzle was realizing just how much cyclical climate changes have influenced humanity in like a really deep way. And what's weird about this is that climate and geography used to be this thing that was taught that, a couple hundred years ago, that this influenced people and societies, and then that fell out of fashion, right? Like, how dare you suggest that people in the North had to be more resourceful than people in the South because they had to plan for the winter to survive. It's like, of course they had to be more resourceful. There's not just fruit growing on trees in the middle of winter in Norway. Like, let me tell you, it's not the case. So that idea, like, for example, the Green Sahara. So that's one, to bring it back to Atlantis, like, this is one of the key pieces of George Sarantitis' work is, and Sarantitis figured all this stuff out from Plato's manuscripts. And for those who don't know, just to kind of, go watch the film, go watch the Atlantis puzzle. But, this idea that Atlantis referred to Western Africa, and you'd say, well, how could that be? It's just a desert. But the fact of the matter is that the Green Sahara is this cyclical climate change that's been going on every 20,000 years. There's these cycles, right, of wet and dry. So right now we're almost at peak dryness. But if you kind of go back to the early to mid Holocene, right? If you go back to, 10,000 BC, that's kind of when it started to get wet. And then, all the way down to about 3000 BC, the Sahara was a much greener place. There were massive mega lakes that were like the size of the Great Lakes of the US and Canada, right? I mean, some of them even much bigger. And like, for example, Lake Chad, which today is shrunken down to this like tiny little thing. You can kind of see it in the lower part of your screen there, that little green area, in the lower right. Like Lake Chad used to be a lake the size of Germany. Now think about that for a second. I think this is a different lake, but yeah, if you look, zoom out just a little more to the right, a little bit more. Yeah. A little more to the right, I think. But anyway, we can. Yeah, I think it's over there on the edge of the screen. But so yeah, for people who, you look at that today and you say, well, how this is pretty clear cut, right? Look at this desert. Look at the size of this. I mean, this is the size of the US or Australia, right? I mean, the Sahara is a massive kind of dead zone, super dry. So, well, what happened? Well, this, I mean, I'm almost speechless, like stuttering to try to explain this, but like everybody just always thought that this was just desert. And about 150 years ago, I think Heinrich Barth, who was this German explorer, did this whole like Saharan trip. And during that time, he started seeing this rock art and these stone tools and these carvings of animals and stuff in the Sahara. And he realized, wow, the climate here must have been totally different. There's like carvings of, giraffes and crocodiles and fish and stuff. Where are the giraffes and crocodiles and fish today? The climate had to have been different, but at that time they didn't have the scientific awareness to understand that this was the case. So you look at this 20,000 year cycle, which has been more or less pretty regular. It doesn't just go back hundreds of thousands of years. I think they've done core tests off the edge of West Africa, and they found that this goes back like at least 8 million years, which is the
Wow.
whole period of human evolution, right? From the simplest apes to today. So that to me, that's mind blowing right there. It puts you in this frame of kind of almost like a cosmic relationship to the earth and these cycles which change the climate, and they're all these sort of natural forces which are interacting. It's extremely complex. It's the opposite of this static model that maybe our grandparents or their parents grew up with.
Yeah, yeah. I was going to ask you more about, can we get into some of the stuff that George sort of found by studying in depth Critias and Timaeus?
Totally. Yeah. Fire
So
away,
what?
guys.
Yeah.
I
What?
love
Well, what
this
are some
stuff.
of the main? I mean, because I don't want to. Yeah, I wanted to. Darren hasn't seen the show yet, but
We don't want to spoil it for
yeah. Well,
him.
Oh,
but
don't worry about that. We
this
don't
is going to be
spoil
a
it for the
spoiler. So
audience.
what
But
are
yeah,
some of
our
the
audience
main
is pretty well
differences?
versed in Atlantis. We've had a bunch of different people on. Of course, Randall's a regular guest. So I mean, our audience probably leans towards the Azores. We were planning like a trip there.
Yeah. Well, guys, if you watch this, Darren, you may want to lean in another direction. That's what I'll
Uh-oh.
say about that. So
We-
Timaeus and Critias, right, were two of the last three books that Plato wrote toward the end of his life, right? So these were probably written sometime around like 360 BC, something like that. And for people who don't know, okay, Plato was sort of this major figure in the center of the philosophical tradition of the Western world. He was the first major philosopher to write a lot of books that we still have today. So before him, you had Socrates, who everybody knows, right? Socrates, who didn't write anything, and he was Plato's teacher. And then before Socrates, you had these guys called the pre-Socratics, and this is all in Greece, right? And we have like little fragments of these guys, but by and large, we don't have much left for them. Plato, we have all these books, so that's what makes him different. And, he was not generally a guy who wrote about lost continents, right? He was a philosopher. So he's always writing, and a lot of his dialogues feature Socrates asking questions to people about just like, what's a good life? How should we govern our city? Should we go to war? Should we not? What's going to make you a better person? Should, even like, how should you exercise and what should your diet be? Like, so, these guys, and Plato's day job was he was the headmaster of a school called the Academy, which was kind of like the first university, right? So he was teaching all like the best and brightest minds of the ancient Greek world, including a guy named Aristotle, who a lot of people I'm sure have heard of as well. So this is who this guy is. So toward the end of his life, he's writing these books, and he writes Timaeus. That's the first one that exists in its entirety. And then he writes Critias, which is pretty short. And by modern standards, maybe it's like 15, 20 pages long, and it sort of cuts off mid-sentence. So these are the books that contain the Atlantis story. This is the first appearance of this story. All subsequent authors were referring back to Plato, right, when they talked about this story. So one of the things that George Sarantitis, who's this Greek researcher. He's from Athens, and he had written a book, I think it was called Plato's Atlantis. Sarantitis dove into this about 20, 25 years ago. And because he loved philosophy and he loved the ancient world, and he could read and write ancient Greek. So he had an advantage that a lot of us don't have. My own, I studied Latin in high school and college. I've taught myself ancient Greek in a very minimalistic way. It's very difficult, and I'm not good at it by any means. But so Sarantitis and a lot of Greeks study this in high school and college the way that we would study Spanish or French and stuff like that. So these guys, so Sarantitis is very well versed not just in philosophy but also in history. And his formal education was as an engineer, so he's a very logical guy, used to dealing with logic chains and logical gates. Well, philosophy appeals to somebody like that, right? I mean, Plato and Aristotle, the guys who kind of were at the roots of creating the logic that we teach in school today, right? So I don't necessarily think that means all people before that were illogical, but these are the guys who formalized a lot of this thought. So what's going on here? Well, you got George Sarantitis reading Plato, and it sort of stops him in his tracks. And he says, wait a minute. Just like, you ever have like an epiphany one day where you're just reading and you're like, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. He's sitting there reading and he's like, why the hell did a guy who's concerned with logic and rationality and this, that, and the other, why did he write a mythological story? And it's not the only one. He's written other myths. Plato uses other myths in his books. Why was he using these mythological stories? What are we supposed to be getting out of this? Like, that seems like a pretty blatant contradiction. It's like, if a nuclear physicist today is suddenly writing a book about Nordic gods, you're like, what is going on? This doesn't fit the pattern, right? So he started diving into this, and he kind of developed this theory after spending a lot of time with it, that Plato using the Atlantis story was meant to teach you something, right? You were supposed to struggle and be confused, and you had to kind of figure it out. And I know, for some people are going to say, well, this sounds a little ridiculous. You're saying there's like hidden puzzles and things in these stories. Well, if you go back and read them, you're going to see this yourself, right? So there was a different way of reading and writing in the ancient world, frankly, that went until about maybe 200 years ago. And that's this idea of esoteric writing. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this idea or not. But esoteric writing is basically boils down to writing on multiple levels, right? So I have a kind of a surface story, and then I have kind of deeper levels of meaning that are sort of hidden kind of in plain sight, for lack of a better way to explain it. So Sarantitis starts reading all this, and he says, well, one of the most puzzling aspects about this is, well, there's twofold. One, the first big whammy, the thing that just blew up in his face, was he's reading this, and he's reading the Greek, and he's reading kind of modern translations, and they say, you got to go to get to Greece, or sorry, to get to Atlantis from Greece, you got to cross the Atlantic Ocean, and it's out there somewhere. And oh, by the way, in the old days, you could navigate across the Atlantic Ocean, but now these days, it's sort of dried up. Well, guys, when's the last time the Atlantic Ocean dried up? Like never, right? So right off the bat, he's saying, and then he said, wait a minute, it doesn't say Atlantic Ocean. It says Atlantic Pelagos. And a pelagos is meant like a sea, like the Aegean Sea. And today, modern Greeks still use the word pelagos to refer to bodies of water like the Aegean Sea or the Ionian or the Adriatic Sea, right? It's a sort of a body of water partially surrounded by land. That's what it means. That is the dictionary definition. So Sarantitis says, wait a minute, why did all these guys the last couple hundred years, and it was mostly guys, translating this stuff, why did these guys say it was the Atlantic Ocean? That's literally not what it says, right? Like if Darren has a boat on Lake Ontario, or he has a boat on Ontario Pond, some random place up in Saskatchewan that I've never heard of, those are two different places. So if I'm reading a note that Darren wrote and he says, hey, I took my boat out of the water up at Ontario Pond, and I translate that as, oh, he took his boat out of Lake Ontario, that's the analogy, right? That's basically what happened. And this is almost impossible for us to understand, because you say, how could these guys have made this mistake? But the fact of the matter is, this is what it says in every single translation. Why did people do this? Well, think about when they were writing. Again, 1800s, these guys were making these translations. Nobody knew about the Green Sahara. They didn't have the climate knowledge to think that there could have been other seas and lakes in North Africa or in other places. They just said, hey, Wigglesworth the 17th. Have you heard of the Atlantic Pelagos? Like, I say, old man, I haven't. You must have meant to the Atlantic Ocean. And then they just wrote Atlantic Ocean. They moved on. So Sarantitis, he's like, wait a minute, I got to go back and really read this more carefully. So that was the start of how Sarantitis started picking apart these mistranslations, which had kind of taken the Atlantis story and turned it into a fable.
Yeah, and he found a whole bunch of mistranslated things, right? I mean, one you already mentioned, the Pillars of Hercules was multiple places all over the Mediterranean, it seems, not just the straits at the Strait of Gibraltar.
Yeah, that's sort of where it wound up, right? So I think, and maybe we don't do a great job in the film of explaining this, but we're not saying that the Pillars of Heracles aren't at the Strait of Gibraltar, like that's where they are today, right?
Yeah.
I think the point is just, if you go back and read ancient authors, people are describing them at different places at different times, right? They're all around the Mediterranean, and even like up in Northern Europe and over in Egypt and in the Black Sea and stuff like that. So, that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Again, it's this idea of the fixed world versus the world that's in flux, right? The world that's changing. And so if you just have your blinders on and you're like, nope, Strait of Gibraltar, that's where it is, like, don't bullshit me, you're not going to open your eyes. And you go back, like I was looking at Tacitus, who was a Roman historian a few weeks ago, and he's talking about somebody who's reporting Pillars of Heracles up in like northern Germany at the mouth of the Rhine or something like that. So it obviously had a more symbolic meaning. It wasn't that Hercules in the distant past went around just plopping down pillars and making buildings all over the known world, right? There's something more here. And the meaning that came through there was, hey, this is something that was in flux. And maybe this represented the expanding Greek seafaring tradition, right? Where these guys would expand out. And as you knew more and more of the known world, the pillars kind of were like this mythological end of the known world, right? So if they keep, as you know more and more of the world, you got to keep pushing them out. And finally, they got to the Strait of Gibraltar, and there was nowhere further to push, right? It's unclear. There are some people who suggest Greeks or Romans might have made it to North America or South America. I don't think that that's been conclusively decided, but certainly there was no further kind of gateway where you could say this is like a sort of narrow, passage where we could say this is a marking a kind of gateway. Then next thing you know, you're out in the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah.
So that was another big one that now meant that, because for those who don't know, it's sort of, this story sort of says, look, to get there, you got to cross this Atlantic Pelagos, which is this sea, and where the Atlantic Pelagos joins the Mediterranean, that's where there's Pillars of Heracles. And the Egyptian says that, it's sort of, as you Greeks call them, Pillars of Heracles, right? So this idea that this actually must have, by a lot of syntax and grammar, probably been in North Africa, was a big light bulb that went off in Sarantitis's head. So he started trying to figure this out. And, by a process of deduction, which we go through in some detail in the film, he got to the bottom of a lot of these mysteries. So Graham, another one I think you might be thinking of is like this idea of, did a continent sink? Right? Because that's the classic story. Yeah. And that's if you go back and read the story, it says something more like an island see, there's a word that means island, and I'm blanking on the ancient Greek at the moment, but this could mean, there were three meanings. There's a continent, this sort of pointy island that's described, and then there's this sort of ringed capital city
Yeah.
concentric ring island, which I think a lot of people now know people are referring to in
Richat.
Sarantitis' theory as the Richat structure. Yeah. So what's so astonishing is that Sarantitis had never heard of the Richat when he started his research. And then he kind of created this map of how this continent body of land should look. And then he became convinced it was Western Africa. And then lo and behold, he goes out and looks, and boom, he finds. And by the way, the capital city is said to be, right at the center of the continent. And if you kind of look at northwestern Africa and just imagine there's like a semicircle there, and imagine those low-lying areas of land have seas, lakes, rivers, marshlands, wetlands, as they did in the Green Sahara. You could imagine this kind of C-shaped continent, and boom, right in the middle of it, lo and behold, there's this ringed capital structure, which is unique
It
on the
really
planet.
is. It really is. I mean, when I zoom in here just slowly, like, I mean, look at how obvious it becomes, right? I mean, I found it just by accident before our show. I was like, I'm just going to look around on Google Maps a bit, and sure enough, like this just popped out. Like, look at that. Hey, Darren, this is from
Yeah.
Google Maps here. I mean, how can you? I mean, that's just it. It's really hard to. I don't know, man. It just doesn't seem natural.
Yeah, and
And there's
it is
ruins
a
all around it
natural.
too, right? There's ruins all around it too. Like it's just,
Well, that's one of the mysteries, right? Is
or it seems like it.
they have identified hundreds of ruined old stone buildings and things there, but nobody's, I think, been out there and actually dated those and
Yeah, it
tried to
seems like
figure
it's
out.
quite out of the way, right? I mean, it's
But if you think back to the Green Sahara, I mean, they found freshwater and like kind of like brackish water fossils in the Richat. This place was full of water. That's not a controversial assertion, right? So you have to imagine this place is green. And the other weird thing about that map is the Adrar Plateau, right? It kind of looks like a rhombus shaped
yeah. I was just gonna show you that.
thing, and it's
Yeah,
this sort of, if you zoom out a little bit, I mean, it's a weird feature. And in the Platonic dialogue, if you zoom out even further, like he sort of says that the tip of the point of this points toward the Pillars of Heracles. So if you kind of zoom out a little further and go over to Tunisia, I mean,
yeah,
it's pretty damn close. I mean, it's off 5 degrees or something, but the idea of Sarantitis is the pillars are at this area, yeah, the Gulf of Gabez, and you can't quite see it here, but you see this big depression and all this stuff. Those are lakes called shots, and we talk about this in the film. In the Green Sahara, all this stuff was linked. You can see the water, where there was water here, right? And this is again not a controversial statement that if you go back to the Green Sahara, all this stuff was full of water. And if you zoom out even more, the size of this lake was, again, it was like the size of one of the modern Great Lakes. I mean, it was huge. That whole depression there, that whole kind of sandy depression, was probably filled up, if not with the lake, then with kind of wetlands and river systems that
yeah,
flowed and brought water into it. Because the elevation changes, you remember on the one side you got the Atlas Mountains, and then the other side you got the African highlands. So all this water is flowing down into these kind of what look today like almost sand seas, right? So you can imagine that in a period of massive wetlands, like think of like the Congo today. I
yeah.
mean, that's not quite what it would have, that's not to that extent of the humidity, but a tremendous amount of water and in tremendous monsoon seasons that, brought these flows of water. So, and the other weird thing is the Niger River, until the Holocene, flowed northward. There was a branch of the river that flowed northward, kind of, yeah, they're in Mali. And yeah, like right around that region there. I know if you kind of, yeah, that's Lake Fagwa Bean, I
Man,
think. Up to the north of that, there was a branch. You can almost see it. that kind of trickled north until, maybe, I don't know, 12,000 years ago, 15,000 years ago. It's not, I don't know that that's been conclusively
Yeah.
determined
Yeah.
either. And you say,
The
well,
whole
God
thing
damn it.
looks great.
Yeah.
The whole thing looks great, east to west. Go back to that map, Graham.
Yeah. And
Did you
you'd say,
close
well,
it?
why aren't people out there
Like,
studying
look, you
all
can
this
see
stuff?
where all
Yeah.
that washed right into the ocean.
Well, that's
Doesn't it look
all
like
that
that's
that
all
that
washed? Like, I mean, look at that. It looks like it washes right across the whole continent into the ocean. Were there ice sheets in Europe? There
mm,
must have been.
so there were some glaciers up in the Atlas Mountains, but you got to be careful here, Darren, because what you're seeing there, that's from winds. Because remember, this is all sand today. So those are actually wind
Oh,
patterns
wind pattern.
yeah, exactly. Because I know somebody talked about this, thinking, oh, a massive continent sweeping flood, like, blasted across here. But what happens is the lakes, once the water evaporates, I mean, you just think about, if you're on the beach, what's the difference between dry sand and wet sand? And if you've ever been on the beach when there's a windstorm, right? I mean, it just starts shifting and blowing. And I live in the desert, and I can tell you that you don't want to be out in the middle of the desert when there's a windstorm going. So that's another, but that's a great point, and that's led other people to speculate. But there wasn't there wasn't an amount of water out there that would have produced all that kind of stuff. I think, well, in the film, we did meet with a guy named Dr. Scott Ashford, who's an earthquake and natural disaster expert at Oregon State University, and we talked through, this idea that a tsunami, like Graham, this was the classic idea, right? This is the Ignatius Donnelly idea. A tsunami sank a continent somewhere. Well, it turns out that if you look at physics, there's just not enough force in a tsunami to sink a continent. That's out of the question, right? It's like, yeah, it's like driving down the street in through a big puddle with your truck and you splash a kid. I mean, it might knock them down, but it's not washing them out to sea, right?
I
So
guess my
yeah.
point was that maybe now, since then we know about isostatic depression, and when the ice sheets melted in the Younger Dryas, that the land masses kind of went up and down. Like that's where they say the mid Atlantic went down from that. So
Mm, yeah. Oh,
that's
that may be partially the case. But the thing is, I'm not sure that how far that's been proven. Certainly, you can see evidence of land shifting, like in Denmark. My wife is from Denmark, and I've spent a bunch of time there. And the northern end of Denmark tilts up, and the southern end tilts down. And you say, why the hell would that be? Well, it's because the glaciers were on the north side of the country, and so when they melted, it had some
yeah,
rise. But
yeah,
we're not talking about, a mile of rise. We're talking about, I don't know, 100 meters or
yeah,
or
yeah,
something like
exactly.
that.
But I
Yeah.
was just thinking maybe they could both be. I mean, maybe if that mid Atlantic ridge was up, and it was also the Richat structure and that whole western thing, like George says. I mean,
Hmm.
maybe. I mean, could it not be all of the above too? In some ways, I mean,
Well,
I
if you
don't
think
know.
about, one of the other things, like we briefly touched on, was this ancient seafaring idea. And this is like the thing that I thought was going to be totally fake and wrong and bullshit when I started doing the research for this documentary. And it turned out to be one of the most convincing, the most evidence for. And if you think about it, you just go back 12,000 years, or 11,000 years, and you think about people in this wet environment. Well, we know that the two language groups of North Africa sort of did like this, or maybe it's like that. I don't know which way my camera's facing, but Niger Congo and Nilo Saharan spread across North Africa. And those two language groups, they can trace back to opposite sides of the continent. So you say, well, what happened? These guys just didn't feel like talking for like thousands of years, and then suddenly they decided to become pals. Well, if there's 10,000 years of desert and you're a Stone Age hunter gatherer or whatever, you're probably not going to make the trip just for yucks. But once the climate changes and these waterways appear, very rapidly people started cruising on out. And it seems very likely, based on discoveries of prehistoric canoes and things, that at least 9,000 years, probably something, probably hundreds of thousands of years. It's just hard to say because, you know, wood obviously rots. And all ancient boats are made out of wood, or, you know, there's those reed boats in Egypt and stuff like that. I mean, or skins stretched over frames. And I think there's been a lot of guys who've conclusively shown, like experimental archaeologists who've gone out and sailed in these things. And there's people who've recreated traditional canoes and sailed across the Pacific. Like, so it's not like it was beyond. Well, and that's the other thing. How do people think the Pacific Islands got peopled? I mean, they were peopled by people with Stone Age technology, stone tools and wooden boats, and they managed to cover thousands and thousands and thousands of kilometers of space in a rather rapid time period. So what's mind-boggling is you go back and you look at some of these canoes from prehistory, like the Defuna canoe, which is from 6500 BC. It doesn't look that different than canoes that were being used up until like 120 years ago.
Wow.
Right? Yeah.
And that's without even getting into like, so what's your take before we start to wrap up? What's your take on like a lost civilization? Because I mean, seafaring is one thing, but I mean, you start looking at some. I don't have. Where's my chunk of A's? Here it is. Man. Then you pull something like this out from underneath the pyramid in Egypt, and there's not a straight edge on this thing anywhere, and there's clear evidence of machining on it, and it's just like,
right.
You know, there's nothing in my history class that allows for this, and I haven't even like I've seen the full ones. And you can see that they do the scans on the full ones now. There's not even the top edge that looks flat isn't really flat, and it's a uniform thing all the way around. So that like institutes high technology. So what about? I mean, I've thought about before. What if Atlantis wasn't just a place? It was like right now we call this place Earth, you know, and it's, you know, you could go to Australia and they'll say it's Earth, and you could go to Europe and they'll say it's Earth, and you can go to wherever and it's Earth. That's what we call the planet Earth. And it's like, well, maybe just back in the day, that's what they were calling Atlantis was just what we called this fucking place. The planet was Atlantis, because it just seems to me that the one thing that we can all agree on, and not us figuratively, but the alternative and the all this and that, is that, you know, there's a lot more to this history than they're letting on. And then you find Göbekli Tepe, and there's just, you know, more and more compounding evidence that these guys were doing stuff. And I mean, the stuff in Egypt, and this isn't small stuff, you know, the stuff that they were able to achieve in those pyramids. It's not just a pile of blocks. And I mean, when you go in there, you look inside it, you look at the precision and the stuff they're able to do. It's like they were instituting technology or something at a level that, boats aside, they were using technology that we're not using today. It might, you know, maybe we could, maybe we couldn't. I build stuff for a living, big stuff. And I would maintain that I'm not convinced that we could build a pyramid. You know, even with all our cranes and everything else that we got, it's going to be fucking tricky. You're going to be using helicopters for the top, you know, few hundred feet of it, unless you got a tower crane or something, but it's going to get weird. So, you know, I'd just like to get your thoughts on all of that sort of stuff before Atlantis aside. What's your thought on just going past seafaring? We have these maps that seem to show that, it's a Pierce whatever map that shows that Antarctica maybe had they were showing the like under ice coastline back in the day. So, you know, I'll leave it at that.
Sure. Well, I mean, this is one of the biggest questions, right? Anybody who's interested in the ancient world and in ancient mysteries, there's always this sort of element of the unknown. And the fact of the matter is, of course, there are lost civilizations, right? If humanity goes back 300,000 years and we've been more or less biologically the same for 250,000 years, how many societies, how many kingdoms, how many even empires, whole periods of time of language or wars or massive things happened that we don't know anything about? And the answer is there's got to be plenty, right? So, like whether or not the level of technology was here, or whether certainly it can rise and then fall again, right? Um, I don't necessarily believe personally that there was a period of time where there was a civilization more technologically advanced than we are today. I think what's clear though is that we've underestimated the advancement of ancient people, how smart they were, how resourceful they were, where they traveled, what they could do, right? And that's been shown over and over again, right? If you just look at the last 20 years, people keep finding new discoveries. It only pushes the direction back in one way, and it's always, oh, we thought that this, people didn't do this till 2000 BC. Now we found out it was 5000 BC. Or, oh, we didn't think people had boats until, like, I thought the Egyptians created boats. Oh, now it looks like dudes a million years ago had boats. Okay, so there's a million years of seafaring? Like, what tales do we not have from that period of time? So I think, one of the other great discoveries, I'll just, just to loop in, is that we had this idea that people were only like living in shelters for like the last, like, I don't know, 25,000 years. And because that was some of the oldest stuff that we found, right? There was like some town, little mini town up in the Czech Republic or something, which mammoth hunters were living in these huts made out of mammoth bones and skins and stuff. And that was like the oldest civilization sort of dwelling that anyone had ever found. But just recently in Africa, they dug up these, what looks like almost like a post and lintel kind of construction, or these two pieces of wood that have been shaped with, probably with stone tools. It's from 500,000 years ago. So what was that, a building? Was that
Wow.
part of a boat? Was it a dam that someone built to fish off of? Nobody knows, right? Because you only have part of it, the rest of it's rotted. It's a miracle this was preserved. But 500,000 years ago, if people were building like, timber frame buildings, it suddenly changes your perspective on humanity and it opens the door. So I guess, Darren,
Yeah.
to answer your
Yeah.
question, I don't know, and it doesn't really matter what my personal opinion is. It matters where we follow the evidence, and the evidence keeps leading us back in the direction of more and more advanced stuff keeps popping up from like shockingly old dates. So clearly, without writing and without records, it's really hard to piece together, right? So, I think I'm excited because I think we live in a time where we are starting to realize how limited and narrow our view of ancient history was, in the last century. And I think we're starting to find out, hey, maybe what Ignatius Donnelly was saying wasn't true, but it doesn't mean that that kind of thinking where you're pulling different things together isn't going to be necessary in understanding the evolution of what we know about the distant past.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe his conclusion wasn't exactly the same. Well, it's not the same as what you guys have, but maybe it's not true, but maybe some of the threads that he was pulling on will end up being true. So one last little teaser, not, and I don't want to say the answer, the book, but you guys, and because I had never heard this before. I don't know how common knowledge this is, but you guys came up with the idea that Critias that gets cut off, you found where it starts up again right afterwards in a
This
book.
is, yeah, for
So
people who are going to go watch the Atlantis puzzle documentary, which is, out
yeah,
streaming all over the place,
don't
Amazon,
say
here,
it.
there. You're going to come to the end and you're going to find something remarkable. And again, for people who like ancient mysteries, I think you're going to see things where maps line up with natural features, and you're going to see things where texts that academics thought, oh, like Plato just died, he didn't finish writing this book, or he was too lazy, or he went and wrote another book instead of finishing this one. We just, for the same way, we show, I think, and this is Sarantitis' theory, just how short-sighted this was. So if you're looking for a surprise, and if you're looking for how deeply Plato connected ideas across time and into myth, and maybe wove actual history together with mythology and with the history of his own time and with philosophy and with ideas from Egypt and from all over the Mediterranean. then I think you're going to enjoy the Atlantis puzzle. So I hope everybody gets a chance to watch it and continues to think for themselves, right? You don't have to accept these ideas of Sarantitis or myself or, Graham or Darren, but, give them a fair shot. Use this as an opportunity to think for yourself. And there's so many mysteries out there still left to be explored. I think it's really important we train up a new generation of people to be asking these questions. And you guys are obviously going a long way to doing that up north of the border.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Jack. This has been great. Where can people find all your stuff? Like, do you have any social media, websites, all that stuff? We'll have it all in the show notes, but half these people, they can't be bothered.
Yeah, you can check out atlantispuzzle.com or just Google the Atlantis Puzzle. It's on Amazon, it's on Google Play, it's on YouTube Movies. It'll be coming out on other platforms, through the end of the year. So check that out. My film company is called Empire Builder Productions, so you can check that out. And we'll have, just go through and click through on the film poster. And we have all the info up there, all the links where you can watch it. And we'll be posting lots more interviews and fun little tidbits and pieces, not just from me, but from George Sarantitis, whose theories we explore in the film.
Right on. Thanks. It was great. I recommend it to everybody. So
fantastic, fellas. Thanks for having me. It was a real pleasure to get to chat about these things.
Right on. Thanks, buddy. Take care.
Thanks, Jack. Have a good night.
Take care, fellas.
And that was a chat. Jack Kelley. What'd you think?
Oh yeah, it was great.
It was a fun one, huh?
Yeah. It almost got. I mean, it's pretty convincing.
It's got to be extra weird coming like fresh off of reading Ignatius'
Oh yeah.
book. Yeah. Like you're just literally finishing it up.
Yeah.
So, of course, that audiobook will be coming out soon. So keep an eye out for that over at adultbrain.ca. Big thanks to Jack for coming on the show. Big thanks to you guys for listening. Even bigger thanks if you're one of our nobles or our lords or our ladies. Head over to grammatical.ca/support today. Sign up for a monthly or make a one-time donation and help us keep going. We're fully listener supported over here. Of course, you can check out grammaticaoutloud.ca for other podcasts. Contact at the cabin for the trips. We got some great trips coming up. One next month in Invermere. It's coming up quick. You could have the time of your life in like 3 weeks and you don't even know it yet. You just decide that just right now. Oh, I'm gonna have the time of my life. Done. And then we got another one with Randall Carlson next. So you can come to that and you can argue Jack's points to him and see what he says.
Yeah.
Check that out. Spam Graham at grammatical.com. Other than that, we love you guys. Thanks for listening. And we will see you next week.